The family living in a CR who found a table waiting for them, a Thanksgiving miracle. Imagine spending Thanksgiving not around a warm table, but curled up inside a freezing minivan, praying your children don't wake up crying from hunger. This is the story of a family who once had a home, a garden, laughter, dreams, and lost it all in a matter of weeks. A father injured. A mother laid off. A family pushed out of their home and into the cold reality of survival. They slept sitting upright. They hid their pain from their children. They locked their doors at night, terrified of footsteps outside. Every morning they fought to pretend life was normal, when nothing was normal at all. But just when hope seemed gone, when the engine died, when the hunger grew, when the world felt like it had forgotten them, a stranger stepped in. And on Thanksgiving Day, a table waited for them. A real table. A warm meal. Their names written on cards. A reminder that even in the darkest moments someone, somewhere, still cares. This Thanksgiving you're about to witness a miracle. Welcome to African Stories by Asada, the Cynic Driver's YouTube channel. Where are you watching from? Before we dive into the Thanksgiving True Life series, we encourage you to rate the video and tell us in the comments below if you can relate to this story or know someone who actually went through it. Let us know where you are watching from. Like, share and subscribe so that you will be the first to be notified of our next video coming up. The Peterson family once lived in a modest beige townhome with creaky floors and a small, overgrown garden that Ruth always meant to trim but never did. They weren't wealthy, but their home held warmth, family dinners, laughter, piano music from the second-hand keyboard their youngest son adored. All of that changed in a single devastating month. First, Ruth lost her job when the factory closed without warning. Then her husband, Darren, injured his back lifting heavy machinery and could no longer work. Their savings vanished faster than they imagined, swallowed by medical bills and overdue notices. They fought to stay afloat, juggling payment plans and late-night phone calls to creditors, but the eviction notice still arrived. The afternoon they packed their remaining belongings into their aging Honda minivan felt unreal, like stepping into someone else's nightmare. As the landlord changed the locks behind them, the family stood on the curb with their bags, staring at the one place they had ever truly called home, knowing they had no idea where they would sleep that night. At first, they tried cheap motels, stretching their few remaining dollars on nights that smelled of cigarette smoke and mildew. But within 2 weeks, even that became impossible. The minivan became their new home, cramped, cold, and utterly unforgiving. They parked behind grocery stores, under flickering streetlights, and in quiet church lots where no one would ask them to leave until sunrise. Ruth made games out of their situation for the kids, pretending the minivan was a spaceship or a tiny house adventure, but she cried silently each night when they fell asleep. Darren felt the sting of guilt eating at him, heavier than his injury, heavier than the pain shooting down his spine. He had always been the provider. Now he couldn't even promise his children a bed. Each morning brought the same uncertainty. Where could they safely stay? Where could they shower? How would they keep the kids warm? And still, they tried to maintain dignity, combing their hair in public restrooms and smiling for the world while quietly falling apart. The nights were the worst. Cold seeped into their bones as condensation built on the windows, making the minivan feel smaller and more suffocating. They took turns sleeping upright because lying down made the cramped space impossible. Strange noises kept them awake. Footsteps, cars speeding past, the rustling of wind that sometimes sounded like whispers. One night, a stranger knocked on their window and startled them so badly the children screamed. He staggered away, drunk and muttering, but the fear lingered long after his shadow disappeared into the darkness. They kept the car doors locked after that, even when it made the air inside stifling. Hunger gnawed at them too. Meals became canned soup eaten cold, peanut butter sandwiches, or nothing at all. The kids asked fewer questions with each passing day. Their silence frightened Ruth more than anything. It meant they were learning to accept this life as normal. Despite everything, they still tried to maintain routines. Ruth drove the kids to school each morning, making sure they arrived early so no one would see them climbing out of their car home. Darren stayed behind in the driver's seat, stretching his injured back and hoping no one would report the van for loitering. At school, the kids pretended everything was fine, though their teachers noticed the dark circles under their eyes and the way they slumped in their chairs from exhaustion. One counselor reached out, but the children insisted they were okay. Pride was a heavy burden for the Petersons. They didn't want pity, they wanted their lives back. But the longer they lived in the minivan, the more impossible that seemed. One afternoon, when Ruth returned to pick up the kids, she found Darren gripping the steering wheel, tears streaming down his cheeks. His pain medication was running out, and every movement sent shocks down his spine. Ruth held his hand and reminded him they were still together. It was all they had left, but she clung to that truth like a life raft. As Thanksgiving approached, the world around them grew festive. Store windows filled with orange pumpkins, smiling cartoon turkeys, and glittering holiday displays. For the Petersons, each cheerful decoration felt like an accusation, a reminder of what they no longer had. Ruth found herself avoiding grocery stores entirely. She couldn't stand watching families push overflowing carts filled with stuffing, pies, and cranberry sauce. Their own Thanksgiving plans consisted of splitting one rotisserie chicken, if they could afford it, and maybe sharing a roadside view while pretending it was a dining table. The kids tried to stay hopeful, but even they sensed that this year would be different. They whispered in the back seat at night about the big feast they used to have, Darren's famous mac and cheese, the parade on TV, the smell of cinnamon candles. Ruth overheard them wishing for just one warm meal at a real table. She stayed silent, hiding her trembling. She had no idea how to give them that. On the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, the minivan overheated while they were driving to a grocery store restroom. Smoke billowed from under the hood as Darren limped out and opened it, only to confirm the worst. The vehicle they lived in was now breaking down. Panic surged through the family. Without the minivan, they weren't just homeless, they were stranded. Ruth gripped the steering wheel as if holding it together might somehow fix everything. They had no money for repairs, no relatives to call, and no shelter to fall back on. The kids sat on the curb, hugging their knees and watching other families drive by, warm and secure inside their cars. The contrast felt unbearable. Ruth tried to call local shelters, but every single one was full for the holiday week. It felt like a cruel joke. As the sun set, Darren managed to coax the van into moving again, but only at slow speed. They limped to a nearby park and parked under a street lamp. They slept that night with the smell of burnt engine parts lingering in the cold air. The next morning, a police cruiser approached the minivan. Ruth's heart pounded as the officer stepped out. She braced herself for the worst, being told to move, questioned, or fined. Instead, the officer gently tapped on the window and asked if they were okay. Ruth hesitated, pride clashing with desperation, but eventually she nodded and confessed they were struggling. Darren stared at his hands, ashamed. The officer listened quietly, his expression softening with each detail. He didn't judge them. He didn't lecture them. Instead, he asked if they minded him calling someone, a local outreach worker he knew personally. Ruth felt uneasy but agreed. Within an hour, a woman named Maribel arrived with warm blankets, bottles of water, and a bag of sandwiches. She didn't bombard them with questions. She simply said, "You are not invisible." For the first time in weeks, Ruth felt seen. Maribel checked on them every few hours, bringing small necessities: toothpaste, socks, hot chocolate packets, and even coloring books for the children. She learned their names, their story, and their hopes. She didn't promise miracles, but she promised effort, and that alone felt like a blessing. On Wednesday afternoon, she told them she had arranged something special for Thanksgiving Day. Ruth tried not to raise her hopes. So many promises in their life had evaporated before, but something in Maribel's voice felt sincere. "Just be ready by noon," she said with a smile. That night, the Petersons allowed themselves a small moment of optimism. They shared the sandwiches Maribel brought and laughed quietly as the kids told silly jokes. The world was still harsh, their future uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they felt a flicker of human kindness pushing back against their despair. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and gray. The minivan shuddered as Darren started it, but it managed to move. Ruth combed the kids' hair in the side mirror while Darren splashed bottled water on his face, trying to look presentable. They were nervous. They had no idea what awaited them. As noon approached, Maribel appeared again, waving them to follow her car. The minivan sputtered but kept up as she drove through quiet streets lined with fallen leaves. Eventually, she turned onto a small residential block filled with modest but tidy homes. Holiday wreaths hung on doors. Pumpkins sat on porches. The neighborhood looked like a scene from the life they used to have. When Maribel parked in front of a pale blue house with white shutters, the Petersons exchanged confused glances. Maribel just smiled. "Come inside," she said softly. "There's something you need to see." Ruth stepped inside first and her breath caught. The dining room was decorated with fall garlands and warm yellow lights, and at the center stood a fully set Thanksgiving table, complete with turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, rolls, pies, everything. It looked like a magazine spread, almost unreal. The table had name cards. Name cards. Each of theirs written in careful handwriting. Ruth covered her mouth with her hand as tears spilled down her cheeks. Darren blinked rapidly, struggling to process what he was seeing. The kids gasped and ran toward the table in disbelief. "Is this?" Ruth whispered. Maribel nodded. "This is for you." The word struck Ruth like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "But why?" she choked. "Because," Maribel answered gently, "no family should eat Thanksgiving in a car." The family sat at the table as if in a dream, afraid the moment might vanish if they moved too quickly. Maribel introduced them to the homeowners, an older couple named Jim and Clara who volunteered with her outreach group. They had heard about the Petersons and immediately offered to host them. "We've been blessed," Clara said, her voice warm. "And blessings are meant to be shared." The table smelled of roasted herbs, cinnamon, and fresh bread. The kids couldn't stop smiling. Darren reached for Ruth's hand under the table and squeezed. His eyes glistened, and for the first time in months she saw hope flicker across his face. Every bite of food tasted like healing. They talked, laughed, shared stories. It felt like being welcomed back into the world after drifting on the outskirts for far too long. Ruth kept glancing at the door, half expecting reality to crash in, but it never did. For that afternoon, they were simply a family enjoying Thanksgiving. After the meal, Clara led Ruth to the living room where a small basket waited, filled with toiletries, winter gloves, socks, and gift cards for groceries and gas. "Just a little help," Clara said. "We know it's been a tough road." Ruth tried to refuse, but Clara gently insisted. "Sometimes," she said, "people think accepting help is weakness. But I think it takes great strength to allow others to lift you when you're tired." Ruth broke down, hugging Clara tightly. In another corner of the room, Jim was talking quietly with Darren, asking about his injury and recommending a free clinic that worked with local charities. The kids curled up on the couch, full and content, watching a movie they used to love before everything changed. It felt like stepping into a forgotten version of themselves. As the evening approached, Maribel returned with more news. She had spoken to a community center director, and there was a temporary family shelter opening up space for the weekend. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it meant warm beds, hot showers, and dignity. Ruth stared at her in disbelief. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked again. Maribel's answer remained simple: "Because someone once did it for me." Those words humbled Ruth to her core. She realized kindness wasn't just charity, it was a chain of humanity, passed from one person to another, generation after generation. And now, somehow, they were part of that chain. Darren shook Maribel's hand with both of his, emotion overwhelming him. He had spent so long feeling like a failure that he had forgotten what it was like to feel human again. While the kids played with Clara's old board games, Ruth wandered into the kitchen and stared at the half-empty turkey pan. She remembered the years she used to cook Thanksgiving herself, how the house filled with scents of sage and butter, how Darren carved the turkey while the kids danced around the dining room. Losing their home had taken those moments from them, but today restored something deeper, the feeling that they mattered, that they weren't disposable, that their lives had value. She touched the edge of the pan and whispered, "Thank you," to no one and everyone at once. In that quiet kitchen, she realized that gratitude doesn't always come wrapped in perfection. Sometimes, it arrives broken, hungry, and exhausted, yet still willing to hope. Later, when it was time to leave, the Petersons stood on the porch with Jim, Clara, and Maribel. The sky glowed with soft evening light. The kids carried their gift cards and new gloves proudly, as if they were treasure. Darren shook Jim's hand, promising to check in with the clinic. Ruth hugged Clara again, whispering promises she didn't quite know how to keep but felt compelled to make. Clara simply said, "Pay it forward when you can." As they climbed into their minivan, the vehicle still grumbled, but tonight it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a vessel carrying them forward, to safety, to shelter, to hope. When Ruth looked back at the house, its porch lights glowing warmly, she felt something shift inside her. The world wasn't entirely cold. That night, the family drove to the community shelter with their bellies full and their spirits lighter than they had been in months. When they arrived, volunteers greeted them with smiles, fresh linens, and hot cocoa for the kids. The beds were simple, but to the Petersons they felt like luxury. The children fell asleep almost instantly, nestled under warm blankets instead of curled against car windows. Darren sat on the edge of his mattress, rubbing his back, overwhelmed by the sudden change in their luck. "I didn't think we'd ever get a break," he whispered to Ruth. She brushed his hair back and smiled softly. "We did," she said. "And more will come." For the first time she believed it. Hope had returned like a long-lost friend. Over the next few days their fortunes continued to slowly shift. Maribel arranged for Darren to be seen at the clinic, where a physical therapist offered him free sessions through a charity program. Ruth met with a job counselor who told her about seasonal positions that could lead to permanent work. The children received backpacks, clean clothes, and a chance to participate in after-school programs. Each blessing felt almost too much to bear, as if the universe was finally releasing the pressure valve after months of suffocation. Ruth felt her confidence returning. She walked taller. Darren laughed more. The kids began drawing pictures again, something they had stopped doing in the car. Little by little, their shattered lives began to mend. On the following Sunday, the Petersons returned to the Blue House, not for a meal this time, but to help Clara organize donation boxes. "You don't have to work," Clara told them. "We want to," Ruth insisted. Sorting canned goods and folding clothes felt therapeutic, a way of reclaiming agency. As they worked, Clara gently asked about their long-term goals. Ruth admitted she dreamed of saving enough money to move into a small apartment again. Clara nodded thoughtfully. "We'll get you there," she promised. When Ruth looked at her children laughing as they stacked boxes with Jim, she realized the kids were smiling in a way she hadn't seen in months. Real smiles, not the forced, brave ones they wore during the worst of their hardship. As the Petersons walked back to their minivan, Ruth paused and looked around the neighborhood. Children rode bikes. Neighbors chatted as they hung Christmas lights. The world felt alive again. Darren put his arm around her waist and whispered, "We're going to be okay." She leaned into him, letting the truth of that statement wash over her. They had been homeless, terrified, forgotten. But through the kindness of strangers, no, not strangers anymore but people who chose compassion, their lives were changing. They still had a long road ahead, but they were no longer walking it alone. Ruth took one last look at the Blue House and whispered another silent thank you. This time it wasn't from desperation. It was from genuine gratitude. That Thanksgiving would forever remain etched in their hearts, not because of the food or the decorations but because of what it symbolized. A turning point. A moment when despair loosened its grip and the world opened its arms. They had gone from sleeping in a freezing minivan, terrified of each night, to sitting at a table prepared specifically for them. A table waiting for a family who had lost everything but somehow held on to love. Ruth knew their journey wasn't over. But now they had hope, support, and dignity restored. As they drove toward the shelter that evening, the sky glowing with the last streaks of sunset, the Petersons felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the warmth of being seen, valued, and reminded that even in the darkest chapters, kindness can rewrite the story. And that Thanksgiving, a table had been waiting, just for them. Quick takeaway of the story. The family living in a car who found a table waiting for them is a heartbreaking yet uplifting Thanksgiving tale about the Peterson family, who lose their home after a sudden job loss, a painful injury and months of financial collapse. Forced to live in their aging minivan, they face freezing nights, hunger, danger, and the crushing burden of trying to protect their children from the truth of their hardship. Their pride keeps them from asking for help, but their desperation grows heavier with each passing day. Just when hope seems completely gone, a compassionate outreach worker notices them and refuses to let them fade into invisibility. Through her kindness, and the generosity of an elderly couple, the family is invited to a fully prepared Thanksgiving table made just for them. That moment becomes the turning point in their darkest chapter. The takeaway. Even when life feels merciless and hopeless, a single act of compassion can change everything. Kindness doesn't have to be grand to be life-saving. And sometimes, the greatest blessings arrive at the very moment people feel most forgotten. The story reminds us that no one is too far gone for hope to find them again. Moral lesson. The story reminds us that life can change without warning, and even the strongest families can find themselves in situations they never imagined. Hardship does not always come from poor choices. It often comes from circumstances beyond one's control. And in those painful moments, what people need most isn't judgment, but human kindness. It teaches that no one should ever feel invisible. The world is full of people who are hurting quietly, sleeping in cars, carrying silent burdens, or fighting battles they never asked for. When we choose to notice them, to listen, or to offer even a small kindness, we can alter the entire direction of a life. The story also shows that generosity doesn't require grand gestures. Sometimes it's a warm meal, a safe place to rest, or simply acknowledging someone's humanity. Compassion can spark a chain reaction, one act inspiring another and then another, until hope begins to grow again. Most of all, it reminds us that miracles often come through people. We become the answer to someone's prayer when we open our hearts and make room for those who have lost everything. And in lifting others, we discover that kindness not only changes their lives, it transforms ours as well. Thanks for watching. Please leave comments, Share and subscribe so that you will be the first to be notified of our next video coming up.